Okay, we're on live stream. Good. Okay. Thank you. So, look, welcome everyone, councillors. Ray from Bluff Community Chair, mana whenua representatives to this workshop, the Bluff Wastewater Consent. So, as we know, the purpose of today is about getting a clear understanding around the information we need to give consideration to when we come to make a decision at council. So I think that's a really important piece. Obviously this has been a interesting process because we've been trying to work through this process while we've been trying to understand how regulation is going to change, and the signalling is that it will, how that will fall out, and I think Jeanette did a very good summary of sort of some of those risks and things for consideration, which she'll talk to as well. So I think it is really, really important that this is about making sure we understand the regulatory impacts of the decision we need to make and keep in touch with the fact that we're making a decision around environment and ratepayers. So I'll throw to you, Erin, and we'll get underway.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to start with noting most people will have already been introduced to Jeanette and Andrew, who we have on the screen. Jeanette Campbell's providing our legal advice around the Bluff process, and Andrew Collins is providing our planning advice around navigating, obviously, both the current and proposed new regulatory climate. And Alistair Snow, to my left, has been assisting us with the project management for the process. Oh, and sorry, Jim is up there as well, very far back. So we've also got Jim Bradley from Stantec, who's also been providing our technical wastewater advice on the process as well. Cool. Okay, so as noted by the Chair, this has been an interesting process. We started under the existing Resource Management Act regulatory framework, and then as we've moved through the process, we've gained greater understanding around what is likely to change in the future in that space. So I'm just going to take through a couple of slides just to make sure that we can all remember where we are at. Can we go to the next one? There we go. Thank you. So the process has been underway for a while. In September 2023 was when the first meeting of the technical working group was established, and that got that process underway under the current Resource Management Act around how we move towards options analysis and a best practicable option. That process got to the point where on the 6th of August this year, the Infrastructure and Projects Committee endorsed the criteria and weightings for the multi-criteria analysis for that process. And on the 8th of October, Infrastructure and Projects Committee recommended a preferred option out of that process being status quo treatment with naturalistic wetland, which was to go to Council for endorsement. On the 25th of November, however, the Mayor attended a briefing where the Chief Executive of Te Mata Arawai signalled that there were some pretty significant changes happening in that space. Now, Council staff had been aware of the fact that Te Mata Arawai were looking to bring in new national standards for wastewater discharge and treatment. What we weren't aware of at the time, though, was that we were expecting those standards to supplement the existing Resource Management Act. This was the first time that we became aware that they were likely to actually overhaul that process and significantly change the RMA framework as opposed to just being supplementary to it. So on the 29th of November, the council meeting decision was left on the table pending further legislation updates in that space. Let me just flick to the new slide. Oh, lovely. Cool. So reasonably quickly after that, and only last week, so we've been working very hard to make heads or tails, we got some updates to the legislation which have come through, and I'll ask Jeanette and Andrew to talk to this in a little bit more detail in a moment. But those two new pieces of legislation that have landed in the last week are the Resource Management Consenting and Other Systems Changes Amendment Bill, and the Local Government Water Services Bill. Now, the team have been working through what that means for our consenting process and obviously what that means around those changes that were flagged by Te Mata Arawai. The other thing that has changed in the last week was that there was also a new amendment paper put forward from Chris Bishop ahead of the final reading of the Fast Track Amendment Bill, which introduced removing the Mataitai Reserve and eligibility criteria from the Fast Track Amendment Bill. So that's another change in that space, which we'll talk through a little bit more in a moment. Yeah, cool. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Jeanette and Andrew. I think Jeanette's possibly going to kick off. Just around what do those changes mean for the current process that we've been running and what the consenting environment is looking like moving forward. Jeanette, are you happy to kick off?
Seems to be directed at our project. So there's a lot of legal advice that I've given you over the last, Brandon and I've given you over the last, I don't know, year or so, so much more than would normally be the case because everything is just a moving feast. And it's not just that there's new legislation being proposed, it's that it's having very significant changes on its way to enactment. So you think that a bill is introduced and it says A, but it ends up saying M or something quite different. So the changes that we've had, obviously we've got the fast track bill, which we've given you quite a lot of advice about, but now seems to be not really a path for us. As Erin said, the irony is that at the very last moment, they debated under urgency the fast track bill for 2 nights till midnight. And the first night, there were over 200 amendments to the bill put, and I think a similar number the second night. So, yeah, a very large number of amendments. One of the key ones for us is, as Erin said, the exemption or the ineligibility for fast tracking by being located in a Mataitai Reserve was removed. It's kind of almost too late for us in a way because we were not listed on that basis, and because so many projects have been listed, all the practical reasons that we've outlined for you as to why it'd be hard for us to get listed or get into the fast track in the next little while still remain valid, notwithstanding that ineligibility criterion has been removed. We're just kind of bad timing really for us. So there's the fast track, and then as Erin says, last week we got not one, but 2 new bits of legislation that would affect us. And they are both just bills, so obviously subject to change. But we gave you some advice in relation to one of them on the 9th of December and the other on the 12th of December. And it's that last piece of advice that I'll any of it. Because it's a lot for me to process and a lot for the council to try and get its head around. So as Erin said, she's almost stolen my thunder really because her summary was exactly bang on. But we have got changes that have come through the Local Government Water Services Bill, which was released last week on the 10th. That anticipates that there will be both new environmental performance standards and also infrastructure design solutions. So those are things that the Act provides for, and we haven't seen what either of them are, but obviously one is a sort of a receiving environment standard and one will be, I don't know, you built it with these nuts and bolts in this colour, and that is an infrastructure design solution. So we anticipate seeing the draft versions of those standards maybe not in the first quarter, but towards the end of the first quarter or in the second quarter of next year is the current expectation. And we are, Andrew in particular has had some reasonably good intel, but about what levels of what size communities might be provided for as permitted activities. We think probably smaller communities than Bluff. But again, all of this is non-binding discussions that have happened. So we really need to wait and see where the rubber hits the road on those standards. In the meantime, though, the bill does provide something of a pause for wastewater treatment plant discharges that are expiring like ours. There are a lot of them around the country, and the bill proposes a 2-year extension for consents that are expiring. If the bill is passed in time, then when our consent expires, we will effectively get another 2 years of make up your mind time to design and renewal application. But because there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether A, those provisions stay in the bill, and B, the timing of the bill's passage, it remains my recommendation that the council should prepare an application under the Resource Management Act that can be lodged in time to secure the council's rollover rights under Section 124. I think that preparing such an application is prudent and ensures that you can continue to operate, and that although there are a lot of opportunities potentially arising from the suite of new legislation we've got, none of them are certain, and I would feel nervous about you relying on them at this early stage of their development, because what we have seen lately is that these new legislative tools are subject to a substantial amount of change on the way through, and some legislative, I don't mean to be pejorative, but some legislative flip-flopping along the way, where they start out one way, turn to another, and then go back to the original. So there's certainly no guarantees through any of these tools, but that, you know, there's some brightness on the horizon, but that's really all it is at this stage.
Thanks, Jeanette. Andrew, is there anything that you'd like to add at this stage?
No, I think Jeanette's said it all. Good morning, everyone. It has been a case of dealing with some changing goalposts through this project, but there are opportunities presented through these legislative changes. We'll know more. I think I heard that the discussion document for the wastewater standards, the new national standards, is expected by around about March, so towards the end of the first quarter. That will be quite telling, I think, to see the detail. But I just concur with the advice that I think your report has given 3 options. I think maybe the focus should be on options 1 or 2. Primarily, there are some risks of if you just do nothing, then and the bills don't go to plan or timing, then that does expose the council. So I feel like the options 1 and 2 of your paper, Erin, provide the more prudent pathways forward.
Can I grab a couple of clarifying questions? Jeanette, just a couple of things. From reading your paper and also listening to your review, and thank you for that, my assessment is that we're moving, or the proposal was to move to more a standards-based approach for approval of these things versus a legal sort of, I suppose, interpretive approach. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, and I guess it's on the one hand, you've currently got a discretionary decision by the Regional Council, which is guided by some standards, but has a policy-driven element as well. The intention of the legislation is to move to as much standardisation as possible, so that if you comply with standards, it'll be here you are, let's check you out against the standards, tick, 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 away you go. Of course, we're not sure what those standards are, and if a standard isn't met, you'll be back in the situation of you'll be judged against those standards, and then there'll still be a discretionary element of decision making in areas where you don't comply, if that makes sense. So I think the intention is certainly to move towards a more standards-based regime overall. In the longer term, RM Reform 3 is certainly guided by those principles in the Cabinet paper that directs us to try and make as many things permitted with certain standards as possible. But there are limits on how far that can go, and I don't have any better advice than anyone else about what Taumata Aroa is proposing as standards and whether we will meet them.
Second one is that you've talked to if the bill passes, what's the likelihood of the bill passing within the next calendar year, i.e. in 2025?
I think it's good. Yes, I think it's good. I mean, obviously I don't have a crystal ball and I'm not in charge of everything. So I know you guys will understand the human aspects of this. But I think a speedy legislative process is, can't really be done faster than 6 months. So I know the government is aiming for this to be passed in the middle of next year, and that may be ambitious, but I think in the next 12 months, the prospects are pretty good that a bill will be passed before your consent expires. It just might be tight, and we're not sure what will be in the bill, but I think chances are high, but not guaranteed.
Yeah, right. We will take questions, but I want to make sure questions are particularly related to the speaker, right? So it's in a clarification process, right? So I'm not interested in opinion. It has to be a clarification process. So make sure your question is directed to, in this case, Jeanette or Andrew, and it's related to gaining additional information versus what your view on certain things are. Tom.
Thank you. I don't know whether this is relating to something that's in Jeanette's paper. I don't know whether Erin wants to pick it up or Jeanette directly, but in your paper, Jeanette, under paragraph 5.1b2, so basically we have a situation where the government are expected to be able to pass this bill in July next year. For us to secure, we need to put in our application by the end of June. We could miss by a couple of days or something. That would be ridiculous. But I know under 5.1b2, you mention the fact that by application to Environment Southland, we could have that end June date extended to September, which would make a material difference, given that that then puts it beyond the point where government are expecting to be able to pass that bill. Do you have any other comments on that? I noticed we don't actually have that in your paper, Erin. It's not offered as an option. Is there a reason for that, or I'd really seek clarification on that point.
That's good, Tom.
No, that's okay. I'm happy to start answering that, and then I'll add to Councillor Campbell's question to Jeanette. The reason that I hadn't pulled it into my paper was my understanding was that you applied, and then it was if you applied late, it was at the discretion of the regional council as to whether or not they still accepted it as being lodged in time and had sufficient time to process it. I think, Councillor Campbell, what you're asking is, could we get a approval from the regional council early to say they would accept it up until September? And so I think, Jeanette, that would be the question would be seeking some guidance on.
I'm not even sure that you need me, because Erin is such a great bush lawyer that you could just direct the questions to her. So as Erin said, that's right. This is just a funny function of it, and an unhelpful function of administrative law. But the council is correct. We can, if we miss our date and we lodge between 6 and 3 months prior to our expiry, then we can say to the regional council, look, we're really sorry, we were late. These are the reasons why. Could you please still grant us the ability to continue operating? That is a decision that is entirely in the discretion of the regional council. they would, in my assessment, be likely to grant that, but you are completely at their, I don't say mercy, but in their hands as to what decision they make. There is no ability to appeal that decision. You could judicially review it, but they have a very wide discretion as to what to do at that point. Prior to the 6-month cutoff, you're entitled to continue operating. No one can take.
So just to be clear in that.
Can we say to the council?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to finish that last sentence.
Sorry. So prior to the 6-month cutoff, you have a right. You're entitled to continue to operate if you lodge more than that 6 months in advance. Whereas once you click over into the 6 to 3 month period, it's up to the regional council entirely in their discretion as to whether they grant you that permission to continue operating or not. So you would think it would make perfect sense that we should go to the regional council today in 2024 and say, hey, with all this uncertainty, we'd really like to be able to push it out until, we'd lodge later in August when we know what's going on. Is that okay with you? And they would say, yeah, that's okay with us. You can't do that. You just can't, because that would be the council predetermining an application that it hasn't yet received. So unfortunately, you can't clear it with them in any official sort of sense beforehand, and any assurance that you receive from them beforehand would be very tricky to rely on if they then subsequently said, no, actually, we say you can't keep operating. So the problem from my perspective is that before 6 months, you're entitled to keep operating, and that's a safe place for the council to be. After 6 months, there's a risk you're at someone else's discretion. And I think there's a good chance the regional council would be indulgent with you in the circumstances, but I can't guarantee it to you.
So sorry, just to clarify that then, Jeanette, so that date for us is around June, is that?
So that's the date that it has to be formally lodged.
Yes.
What we need to work through, and this is where Andrew's advice comes in, is essentially that pre-application process, similar to what people would go through with us. Any requests for further information, any questions that the regional council has, all have to be addressed to their satisfaction before the end of June.
Yeah.
So that's where Andrew's given us the date of the 13th of May, which is the date that he believes is the recommended date to make sure that we are have an application into the regional council by, so that we have enough time for them to assess its completeness, ask us any questions, us respond back to those, to make sure that we are formally lodged by the end of June. Andrew, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, sorry, just going to clarify that then, once we've done that,
Yeah.
then we, based on what you've said, Jeanette, we would be able to then have a conversation with them about a potential extension.
If you were lodged before the 30th of June, you wouldn't need an extension. You'd just be entitled to keep operating until that consent was determined, whenever that was. So if you lodge before the 30th of June, there's no risk to council. You're in the driver's seat, really.
Well, but isn't the risk to council that we lodge, they approve it, the bill isn't yet passed, the bill comes through with different sort of requirements, and then we're sort of tangled up?
I think we're bringing two different pieces together here. The only thing that the regional council have the discretion on is what date they accept that the application was lodged. Now, if it's lodged before the 30th of June, we get that, and that's formally lodged, all questions addressed. We get that section 124 rollover to keep operating the consent whilst we go through the process. If we lodge it between June and September, it's up to the council as to whether or not, the regional council, as to whether or not those section 124 provisions are triggered. Neither of those impact on the 2-year extension to a treatment plant's consent, which is provided for under the legislation. That's nothing to do with the regional council. That's the straight up legislative requirement that has to come through when the bill becomes law. Jeanette, anything to add?
No, that's excellent. Thank you, Erin.
Okay, so I've got Rangi, then Evelyn, then Nobby. So, Rangi.
Yeah, hi Jeanette, it's Rangi here. Look, there's been a lot of focus on changes in the regulatory process, RMA, consents and everything, but one thing that hasn't changed or is not changing is the Local Government Act. So I'm just wondering how the Act and everything else relates together, and specifically to section 77(1)(c), and that's in Council's decision-making process, where we have to give decision to land, body of water in relationship to Māori and their cultural and different traditions. Now, how do you see the two acts intermingling? Because I don't see, in one of our decisions that goes to 1F, we have given consideration to section 77. The other two
Hang on.
decisions don't.
No, that's your opinion. So
No. But this,
So I'm happy with the parts of your questions around how does it relate to the Local Government Act.
Well,
So
I'm just-
Jeanette, if you could cover that off, that'd be
it's not
great.
an opinion. I'm saying one does and the others don't. That's why I'm asking. Are they relevant?
Jeanette.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'll say I'm no expert in the Local Government Act, but I do rub up against it all the time. And that's your foundational document, that's your constitution, that gives you your powers and functions and imposes duties on you as well. And you must meet the duties imposed on you under the Local Government Act in terms of all matters, but in the current question in relation to obligations to Māori. Under the Resource Management Act, the obligations to Māori remain unchanged. None of these amendments that have come through, either through the RM amendment, Part 2 obligations to Section 6E to recognise and provide for the relationship. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. Can you guys hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay. All those obligations in Part 2 of the Resource Management Act remain and are relevant matters to guide decision makers to the extent that they're not picked up in the relevant planning documents. And as Andrew will tell you, the planning documents that our application will be assessed against by Environment Southland contain a lot of specific references to those sorts of obligations as well. So I don't see there's any tension between the resource management system and the respect and regard that is paid to matters of significance to iwi and hapu. Those are factors that the Regional Council decision maker will factor into its decision. You too have obligations that other applicants don't have because you are a local body, and those obligations are found under the under your constitutional Local Government Act. So to me, the two pull in the same direction, not opposite directions. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jeanette.
Evelyn?
Kia ora. My question is about the proposed change that Minister Bishop is talking about regarding Mātaitau reserves. Given that the Mātaitau reserve at Bluff is actually under the South Island Customary Fisheries Regulations enabling, which was part of the Ngaitoku Claims Settlement Act and the Fisheries Settlement Act. It's actually a treaty settlement, and I wonder, it's not merely a fisheries management tool, it is actually part of the settlement, a treaty settlement, and my understanding was that none of these things were to affect treaty settlement entitlements.
Yeah.
So has this discussion been raised at all since Minister Bishop proposed this permissiveness within a Mātaitau reserve?
So it's not a proposal. I don't know whether it was discussed. I'm sure it was. They were debating all night on Wednesday and Thursday nights, but it's not a proposal. It is now the law. So what happened was there was no exclusion based on being located in a Mātaitau reserve when the bill was first proposed. Then when it was reported back from Select Committee, the Select Committee recommended that there be such a restriction so that that would add a layer to reasons why you could not advance under the fast track. And that recommendation from the Select Committee, which was in the bill when it went for its second reading, was deleted by the Minister's paper. That was voted on and passed. So the bill is now law, and there is no exclusion based on the Mātaitau reserve status from entry into the Fast Track Act. But that is not relevant to a decision under the Resource Management Act. and its removal from the Fast Track Act, as I said at the outset, it kind of comes too late because we missed out on being listed, and practically, I think, getting entry into the process now when they're already trying to find 150 panels to stand up around the country is, that's certainly not going to be, it's not going to be a fast track. It'll be a lot slower track, and also has a substantially higher bar in terms of engagement with iwi and Māori involvement through the process. Most of that remains unchanged. So it's not, and the Mataitai Reserve, to the extent that it has power through other pieces of legislation, continues to have that power, and also, that status would be relevant to any Resource Management Act decision making, not determinative of anything, but also not irrelevant.
Can I just add to that? Almost a question myself for Jeanette, just to clarify. I think, Jeanette, probably the relevance that change for the fast track has to us, as I understand it, is that I had some nervousness around, whether or not the new standards would actually apply to Bluff at all, because there was the possibility that Mataitai may be a carve-out within the new standards as well. So it sort of brought into question whether those new standards would apply at all. The fact that that change has now been made suggests that the standards may apply to a Mataitai area without it being a carve-out. Would that be a reasonable expectation?
Yes, it would. Will it play out that way? I don't know. I suspect there'll be quite a reaction to that. There are not very many Mataitai reserves in New Zealand. We looked at their extent around the country, and they're not a very, if you were to sum their areas, it's not a very big area. They're quite special places, as I understand it. So there may be quite a reaction to the deletion of that provision from the fast track bill. So on the one hand, Erin, yes, I agree. You'd think it didn't stay in fast track, it came and went. We won't see anything similar in the regulations under the water services bill. On the other hand, the pendulum might swing back in the other direction. I've given up predicting at this point.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify, was there a fear that it could bleed over into the Resource Management Act changes, because it has some quite significant implications in the South Island, because most of the Mataitai actually are in the South Island and come out of the South Island customary fisheries regulations, and several of them are in the Southland area. So that was why my question was, not so much that it's in or not in the Fast Track Act, but the implications that it's going to be used as a tool within resource management to negate the rights and interests, settlement rights and interests under the Mataitai and the customary fisheries regulations. So thank you for that.
Mick Clark.
So just Jeanette, some comments about some of the information you've given us. When you say there's not many Mataitai reserves, it's my understanding in the last 2 weeks of the last parliamentary term, there was something like 400 lodged with the Waitangi Tribunal.
Okay.
Yep. Our iwi colleague has raised an interesting issue.
Hang on, are we asking questions?
Yeah, I'm going to ask her a question.
Right. Yeah.
What she believes will happen with the new water standards that come out. The government's clearly giving us a message that the standards will be the standards, and if you meet the standards, you get a consent. And then, in doing so, it's taking away some of the, I guess, what you might refer to as localism that councils and iwi groups can, I guess, interface in a different way at the moment. But if there's some standardisation, that may preclude that. Is that your take on it?
Yes, there is a top-down driver coming from Wellington. There is also a modicum of respect for localism as well, so it's quite a difficult line to walk, obviously. When we say standards, I'd just like to make one thing clear, which certainly isn't obvious from the ordinary English use of the term. We all think a standard is something that you assess against, and you go to get your warrant of fitness, and the guy ticks the boxes, you meet the standard, you get your warrant of fitness. And I think the new standards will have that sort of aspect, perhaps for smaller wastewater discharges from smaller communities. But the standards can also set activity statuses. And if you think about what's currently in the NPS for freshwater, for example, there are a lot of specified activity statuses that aren't permitted, but they describe if you're this type of thing, if you're this close to a wetland, then you are discretionary or you're non-complying, or in some cases even prohibited. So I think the standards will also make provisions for those sorts of rules, nationally made rules, and that will leave discretion at the local level and allow. So there'll be some dictation, is my guess, and that's all it is. It's not informed by anything, but there'll be some dictation from the top for smaller, less controversial projects that will dictate, tick these boxes and you get your consent, and then there will be some discretion left at the local level, but they will circumscribe the discretion and they will explain the sorts of things that fall within each type of category. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just one other question, which was the time framing that you discussed in the early part of your presentation. So I'll just echo it back to you, and you tell me if I've got this wrong, because I need to understand that. Mm-hmm. So the new standards are going to be prompted by the water regulator in March. Mm-hmm. The government's actually saying at the moment that it'll be actually earlier than that, because they're forcing the hand of the regulator. So this can't be the reason for delays. The minister gets to see them and will agree or disagree to them by May, and then the Act will probably enact them in August. So that's the legislative criteria, and I think there's always questions about what happens as you get to the tail end of that process. So you made reference to, I think, 200 amendments under urgency in 2 nights, and I've had assurances from the RMA ministers collectively that councils will not be hung out on these time frames. That if we get caught, they'll use SOPs, which is supplementary order papers, to make sure that councils aren't missing very finite deadlines and then getting down a bit of a rabbit hole. So I just wanted to clarify for you to clarify for me those timeframes, which is up to August, and what your expectation would be based on what you've seen in Parliament over the last week around the urgency. What would happen if they couldn't get it through by August? And say, for argument's sake, they couldn't get it through till September, which is our deadline. Is it reasonable that they would then change the nature of the bill, just the timing of the bill from August to September under a supplementary order paper?
Yeah, look, those are political questions, and to be honest, your guess is probably better than mine as to the politics of the situation. In terms of the timing of the passage of legislation, I think that broadly those are the sorts of dates that have been talked about. I agree that you've got that absolutely right. As to your question whether those dates are meetable, I suspect not. I would expect ultimate slippage of at least a couple of months, but that's my stab based on one of the constraints that exists with the legislation is that not MFE, but MFE is 400 staff reduced. I'm sitting in the office. There is no one for kilometres around me. They're writing RM Reform 3. They're writing these RM Stage 2 proposals. It's actually a resourcing. It's a resourcing issue for driving all of this legislative change, writing standards, doing all these things. It's all the same people, and there's only so many hands around to do these jobs. So I think it's an aggressive timetable that you've set out, and I think it's more likely than not to slip to a degree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Jeanette, this is just a nervous question from me regarding the liabilities of an elected member. It's with regards if council for some reason goes down that rabbit hole of not lodging a consent and rolls the dice, and our regional council is not as friendly as we hope it to be, and we get from that January 1 we start getting prosecuted for not having an operational consent. Through our decision-making process, councillors as elected members, are we liable? Is there a chance? I'm not saying a yes or no, but I'm just asking, is there a chance?
So it's a really interesting question. I'm sure that's not the answer. Nobody ever wants to hear that from their lawyer, right? The short point is that in a criminal prosecution, I would just note that although it's extremely remote, you're not just at risk of prosecution from the Regional Council. Any person may bring a criminal prosecution under the Resource Management Act. So Joe Bloggs, who's one of your residents who's hot about it, can criminally prosecute you and can secure a fine and a conviction against you if he does the job properly. So that's the first point. Second point is, as you're alluding to, persons concerned in the management of a company or an entity can be personally prosecuted. No councillors have ever been personally prosecuted, and I'm not 100% sure, but I don't believe any council staff have ever been prosecuted in their personal capacity either. It is very common in corporates for multiple human beings to be prosecuted in addition to the company. So as a former prosecutor for Waikato Regional Council, we would standardly file charges against the company directors, and the person who actually committed the physical act that amounted to the offence. So I think it is a theoretical possibility. I think it is very practically unlikely, and I've never heard of it happening.
Thank you.
Righto.
Are you a good defence lawyer?
I've done a lot of prosecutions, and I think that makes you a good defence lawyer.
Yeah, true.
I've done a lot of defence too, but always pleaded guilty, actually, so there you go.
Oh, good on you.
Righto. We digress. Erin.
Good at doing pleas and mitigation, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll just flip to the next one. Okay, so I guess just to bring that a little bit towards, we've got a bit of a funny process here, because with having an extraordinary council immediately afterwards, you already have the paper with the different options that have been provided under the paper with their pros and cons. So I just wanted to take a quick opportunity to work through those in the workshop at the moment. Essentially, we've distilled all the various different pathways down to three options for council's consideration. The first one is to simply continue with the current process under the existing Resource Management Act. So council had already had the technical working group make a recommendation. That recommendation was endorsed by the Infrastructure and Projects Committee in October and passed through to council. Council obviously has the ability, if it wishes, to continue with that process and lodge an application for that status quo treatment plant with a new wetland. The option was supported by the technical working group, Te Ao Marama and the Awarua Runanga. It gives you the ability to lodge under the existing RMA framework, so you know what you are getting with the current framework. There's no uncertainty, or limited uncertainty. It's a pretty straightforward consenting process because we have everybody lined up and agreed with the process, and so we have the ability to simply lodge an application under that, and we've done some feasibility and everything's looking good around the ability to actually deliver that solution. The benefit that it offers is obviously if we did have standards that looked more beneficial to council next year, we could make the option to go, actually, that's a better option for us in the community. We think we'd actually like to change. And Jeanette has advised that we could lodge a second application at that point in time and decide to proceed with a different option. So that there are some pros associated with that option. The cons of it is that if you continued all the way through with the option 1F, it's a $6 million process, $6 million plus process with some operational costs associated with it. And if we went through that process of lodging a second application, you'd be doubling up on those application costs. And again, the other pro is the uncertainty of the impact of any changes in the legislation. The new legislation could provide a much cheaper pathway than that currently explored under option 1F. The second option is the ability to lodge a short-term interim consent, which gives council the ability to not have to make any big investments at this time, to look at what happens, what comes through with those new treatment standards, and then obviously to lodge a new application once the short-term consent expires, in line with those new treatment standards and that new framework that's coming through with the legislation. The benefit to that option is it could potentially significantly reduce the capital cost associated with any upgrades of the plant, and potentially any operational costs associated with that. The council would obviously have a full understanding of what it needs to do under the new standards and the new legislation before making any decision. Wouldn't be in this little bit of a period of flux. And that would be a reasonably simple consent application to prepare for us moving forward. The cons to that process is that whilst the government's talking a good game about simplifying the process, the details may actually not deliver that result. As Jeanette said, there's quite a state of flux, quite a lot of change happening up to the last minute. There's the potential, and although we think it's a remote one, there is the potential that the new standards could increase what we have to do and be more costly than the options currently under 1F. Now, the new standards have, what we'd expect is to see them possibly look at what we might have to do in terms of nitrogen removal, things like that. Those are things that we don't have currently costed into the current process, but it's unlikely that we would have to do something like the wetland option under those new standards. So it's simply a bit of an unknown. Very high possibility that it could be a less costly process for council, but we simply don't know where that legislation and those new standards are going to lie. The negative to that is that once we proceeded down that option, there'd be no opportunity to revert to the previous process. So under option 1A, you can start under the current RMA, see what happens under the new standards, and then make a decision. Under option 2, you would simply be needing to follow that new process under the new standards and legislation. If you decided you didn't like it, there'd be no going back to the option 1F process. The other negative to that is that we've been advised verbally by Te Ao Marama that this isn't an option that they support. Chair, are you happy to have a statement?
No, to keep going.
Okay. That's not an option that they would support. Now, I am conscious that I've heard some differing conversations from different feedback, but at the moment the formal channel to us via Te Ao Marama is that they don't support that short-term option. Based on status quo. And the other negative to this one is that a significant upgrade in 4 years' time, or if council decided a shorter term interim consent of 2 years, may impact our other long-term plan projects. So one of the things that we had to do in preparing the long-term plan was to try to fit all of those capital upgrades into a program that we could deliver, both a program that we had enough people to deliver, but also one that we could afford to do. If we had significant upgrades that we needed to make in 2 or 4 years' time, we'd see those interacting with other projects like our museum, like our alternative water. That would have some impact either on council needing to increase rates to deal with those projects at that time, or potentially us having to delay projects like alternative water by some small amount. Now, that's a worst case scenario. Obviously, the best case scenario is there's little investment that's needed, and that doesn't impact other projects. And the third option is essentially a do nothing. It's a don't lodge an application at this time. Wait to see what happens out of the new legislation. The benefit to that is there's no investment needed at this time in terms of major upgrades. There would be some minor investment in terms of us, we still have some renewal processes with the treatment plant that we would go ahead with regardless, but no major new investment. The other pro is that should the provision of the 2-year extension proposed under the bill come into law before December 2025, council would simply be able to take advantage of that. And there'd be no cost associated with a consent application process at this time. The negatives to that one is that should that legislation not proceed as we expect, council wouldn't have lodged an application in time to get that section 124 rollover provision, and that then further exposes council to the risk of the consent expiring, and as Jeanette noted, that opportunity for either the regional council or a private party to bring a legal action against council. And that final one, and it runs the risk again, similar to option 2, that contrary to our expectations, when we do get to the point of lodging a new long-term consent, the consent pathway may not be what we expect it to be. It may be easier, but it may be a more difficult project in the future. I might pause there. The next piece we want to go through is significance, but I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Yeah, clarity. So it's clear what option 3 is, but what have you got a slide that shows the detail of option 1 and option 2, or 1Fs, or could you run through it? Because it appears that, well, I'm not clear on option 2, and I'm sure others are the same, around what actually, would it just be the existing consent and it's applied, lodged as it is and then applied for, or is there investment in it? Yeah, so could you just run through that please for us?
Cool. So option 1F at that, option 1 is that continuing with the current process. So that's where council got to on, infrastructure and projects got to on the 1F status quo treatment and wetland.
So we've got a wetland.
Yep, that's the option.
We've got a UV upgrade.
Under 1F.
Yep.
At the moment, the option 1F is simply the wetland piece. There would always be a UV upgrade and some pipe renewal simply as part of the upgrade of the process.
Okay.
1F didn't necessarily say we would be bringing those forward, but that's an option that council could elect to do.
Okay, so for clarity, generalising, 1F is what we've got now plus a wetland.
Plus a wetland,
Okay.
that's right. So just to that point, so everybody's clear, that wetland doesn't provide an environmental discharge benefit, but the reason that it was put forward was that it was agreed by the parties that it provided a biodiversity benefit to the area.
Yeah, okay. And then so option 2.
Yeah.
What's that?
And so option 2 is essentially your existing treatment plant. We wouldn't make any major upgrades. We'd obviously still continue to do our renewals of UV and pipe renewals as those things came to end of life. However, we would simply be making an application for the current plant to continue operating on its existing conditions, or the same conditions as we currently have, for a short time period whilst the legislation is worked through.
Yeah, so with the reference point then to the significant upgrade in 4 years' time, so what's in the significant upgrade in 4 years' time?
So that upgrade would be whatever the standards require us to do through that new process.
So that's assuming there's the standards that are regulated by Te Mata Arowai would require some level of upgrade for improved environmental outcomes.
Yeah, so that's on the con side. If it went the way that the standards required something more than what we're currently doing in terms of treatment, there'd be a cost impact to that. If it required us to do no more, then there'd be a cost benefit to council.
Yeah, okay. Could you make the assumption that that cost would be no different to the cost of the 6 million to go with 1F?
No, I can't make that assumption.
Okay.
We simply don't know.
No.
Obviously, the government is talking about it being a cheaper process, but as you will have noted in the paper that I put forward, some of the current consents around the country for smaller plants have got really significant costs with them. The plant for Banks Peninsula is currently servicing a smaller community than Bluff. I think the costs that are touted for that are approaching $90 million. Obviously, the government is looking to try to significantly reduce those sorts of costs. The Palmerston North plant obviously services a lot bigger population, but it's in the 400, I think approaching $500 million category. Obviously, here we're talking about cost increases in the range of $6 to $7 million for the option 1F, whilst the government is talking about significantly reducing costs for council. I'm not sure that they're looking at reducing them to less than $6 million, but they may.
But equally, you know, if you went with 1F, you could, the standards could come in where you actually have to spend additional money to get up to the standards.
So that would only, and Jeanette can clarify this for me, that would only be once you lodged a new consent following that 1F consent expiring. Is that correct, Jeanette?
Almost certainly, yes. Yeah, they wouldn't have the standards have retrospective impact on you if you had got a consent. If you went for a 1F, we think you'd get a reasonably long term. We've said 20, 25 maybe years. And so if you secured a 1F consent, which if you went for a 1F process, that would be quite straightforward. We would hope for, and I wouldn't go quite so far as expect, but we'd have a good chance of being non-notified and having that consent granted without any kerfuffle in a pretty short time frame. So then you'd be looking at, here we are in 2025, you'd have a consent that expired in 2050. You'd be safe from whatever standards until that point, most likely. They don't like to do retrospective stuff. There's rules of law against it.
Well, just before we go, so I think it's either Jim or Andrew.
And sorry, I'm just conscious we've only got Jeanette for 5 more minutes if there are any last questions very quickly for Jeanette.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, okay, I think they'll get through this pretty quickly. So, in your perspectives, have you got anything to add around the sort of options in terms of the environmental outcomes that are achieved by each or either, or anything like that before we have a discussion?
So was that to me?
No, I
to
think
Andrew,
that's to Andrew or Jim.
Yeah, sorry, let you off the hook, Jeanette.
Thanks.
My only comment is that the use of Section 124 is extremely common, and quite often it is, you know, applications are lodged and either due to regional councils' requests for information, or sometimes at the applicant's own request, they can be put on hold. So effectively, you lodge it to get yourself immunity from of any issues post the expiry of the consent, and it's a little bit of a holding mechanism. So that's fairly common, and it buys time to see how the evolving national standards and other legislation emerge. There is an ability to amend an application by adding more into the mitigation package, if you like, but there's less of an opportunity to do the reverse. So when you go in, I suppose, saying you're going to do a certain thing, when you start de-scoping it down, it becomes a different proposal. But yeah, the reverse tends to be more, allowed. So I've nothing particular to add other than that. Jeanette's covered it all, and I agree with what she has been saying.
Jim, did you have anything?
Yes, good morning all. I think the operative thing is the wetland proposal is a naturalistic and following the enhancement of the general area. And I'd like to introduce Sue Bennett to you, who's leading the environmental science on the project, and Sue might just elaborate a little more on there, having lived this for the last year or so and donkey deep in the current investigations of how they naturalistic wetland would come through. I'll just mention, however, that we have a number of examples around New Zealand of similar type approaches put there for various reasons, but often driven substantially by the iwi position and the return and Earth Mother approaches. But anything you could add, Sue, just a bit more detail? Thank you.
Sue, you're still on mute.
Yeah, she's just about to come through, brother.
I apologise. Hi. Yeah, so when we were doing the detail of the assessment, I won't go into all of the detail, but essentially the status quo from a water quality perspective isn't really having any measurable effect in terms of the public health or the ecology of the coastal area. And when you look at 1F, that doesn't, there's a slight risk it could make it slightly worse, but it's only a slight risk and is probably mitigatable. However, the advantage from an environmental perspective of the wetland, as Erin stated, is essentially the improvement in the biodiversity of the area. Wetlands are rare and protected, and also there's not very many of them left in the Southland area. So essentially what we will be doing is reinstating a wetland into the area, and I think that is what was particularly attractive for this particular option. Okay, that's all I will say.
Thank you. Okay, so given Jeanette's got very limited time left with us, is there any questions for Jeanette specifically?
Of Jeanette.
Pardon? For Jeanette specifically. It looks like you've done your job. Done your job, Jeanette.
Last call on legal advice.
Yeah. We do have one from Councillor Barry Stewart.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused about if we're going to be going through the wetlands and there's no advantage or a disadvantage.
Hang on, that's not a Jeanette question, I don't think. No.
Right.
No more for Jeanette.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for tailoring the meeting to a degree so that I could be here to help you for this short period this morning. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Jeanette, you know, you've added significantly to the decision-making process through your good guidance and your paper that we've received as well. So thank you very much for.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's like you guys are in a tough spot. So you know, the reason why this is hard is because it's hard.
That's right.
So, you know, good luck in your decision making.
Thank you. Have a nice Christmas.
Okay. Thanks, you too.
Okay, so just before we open up for questions, is there anything? You've finished all the slides?
No, I'm absolutely happy. We've given the advice on the pros and cons. Happy to open to any further questions.
Okay, cool. Rightio. So we've got a bit of a list here. So we've got Tanya, Trish, Tom, Barry, and then Nobby. So, and then Rhea. So, Tanya.
Just want to make a point on option 2.
Could you speak into the mic, please?
I just wanted to make a point on option 2 that Te Ao Marama are not the only ones that oppose option 2. So does Aotearoa Runaka.
Panya, I still can't hear you,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
Would you put your...
Oh, sorry.
Do the ice cream cone that Leslie talks about.
Wait.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make a point that it wasn't just Te Ao Marama that opposed option 2. Te Runaka or Aotearoa Runaka also does.
Yeah, thank you. Trish.
This is for Erin, thank you. Erin, why is in option 1 a disadvantage not seeing as the cost and the ongoing cost?
Mostly because I'm more focused on the fact that you could change the process if the costs ended up being cheaper that there was less cost and more benefit to changing to the new standards, that you could move to that process whilst you had the 1F lodged. So actually the cost disadvantage to lodging a 1F application was the cost of having, that being a lost application cost if you decided to change later on. But I would expect that if you lodged an application for 1F and then the new standards came out and council went, look, we think that we have greater benefit moving to the new standards process, I wouldn't expect that council would proceed with 1F at that point in time.
Further question, please?
Yeah.
But it is a known cost now, where the other isn't, and I would definitely see it as a disadvantage. That's just my comment, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Tom.
Erin, the option 2, I think recognises the extreme uncertainty that the times that we live in at the moment and will live in through the next year. And therefore option 2 seemed to mirror what government were suggesting in having a 2-year period where councils considered what the new standards meant for them. So my question is, why is option 2 not a 2-year extension? You know, exactly mirroring what government have proposed. By making it 4, it makes it different from that.
Yeah, and look, it's a really good point. At the time that we were writing the paper, we didn't have a great deal of certainty around what that legislative timeframe would look like. So we put in the 4 years because, you know, that was essentially what councils tended to grant, what regional councils tended to grant when they granted a short-term interim consent. And, you know, dare I say it, if we got negotiated down, it gave us a little bit of lee room there. Now that that legislation has come out, we may simply want to lodge with the 2 years. It would be unlikely, I think, that the regional council would negotiate us down now that it had that certainty of the legislation. It was something I probably should have updated, but it was one of those things where we had written that we were very much playing catch up with the legislation after it came out late on Tuesday to get the paper out on Thursday. And so we'd left it at 4 years, but very happy to amend it to 2 if that was council's
supplementary
preference.
Yeah. And just clarifying, the 2 identified upgrade opportunities in the Stantec report was one we already knew about, of course, which was the pipe, the need to realign the pipe. And the other one was the possibility of increasing the disinfection rate through upgrade of the UV. If option 2 was the selected option, would we still consider doing those things within that 2-year period rather than just kick them down the road to the longer term?
Yeah, so at the moment, within those first couple of years, we've already got in place the replacement of the existing UV, and that we would expect that to see a minor increase in the disinfection rate. And similarly, we know that we've got some areas of deterioration on the outfall pipe, and that there's already a process underway to look at relining that pipe. So that would be absolutely going ahead if council went with option 2.
So part of option 2 is not, I mean, I don't like the term status quo really, but it's essentially status quo, but we would realign the pipe and we would look at upgrading the UV. Okay,
that's right.
Thank you.
Okay. I've got Barry, then Nobby, then Ria, Alex, and then
Yeah,
Ray.
I'm just a bit confused with why we're going with the wetland apart from a cultural reason. Because as it's been told already, it's not going to improve the system, it's probably going to downgrade it.
Yep, so I think in the previous October paper we talked through the pros and cons of the various different options. I wasn't intending today to go through the pros and cons of the 1F versus 1G, etc., because I think we've already done that. What I really wanted to work through today was really current RMA process or putting in place that holding pattern until we know more.
Yeah, the legislative piece, which is what you've achieved. Michael.
So, a couple of things, Aaron. You said you had a verbal advice from Tammy.
Can you speak into your mic, please?
That you didn't. You had verbal advice from Tammy. I want to know who and when.
Yeah. So that advice was actually, Alistair, you may want to speak to that because you had that conversation.
Yeah, about 3 days ago I spoke with Tammy just to reconfirm the position, and
that was through Ruria, who was the working group member.
Yep.
So who on Tammy saying that?
Ruria.
Sorry?
Ruria and Tammy. She's the representative.
So she was the representative on the technical working group and our point of contact with Te Ao Marama for this process.
Okay. And I guess for Pania, you said Arua does not support option 2 as well.
Correct.
Are you absolutely sure you have a mandate for that?
Well, we had a meeting last night and we discussed basically our position, which hasn't changed around option 1F.
Yep.
And so therefore we would be supporting Te Ao Marama.
Okay. Why I say that is because Tom and I had a meeting with Barry and with Dean from Te Ao Marama and from Michael Scarrett as well, and we got a different set of advice on that. That was about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
So,
Michael,
further
I just
questions?
have to highlight that Michael Scarrett's not Awaroa.
No, but Barry Bragg is the chair.
He is the chair, and
Yes.
this was on our table last night.
He was or wasn't?
It was. No, the
He
meeting was
is.
held and Barry was there.
Yes,
Yep.
correct.
That's
He's the
okay.
chair,
Just-
not the dictator.
Yep. Further question, Chair.
Don't make comments like that, please.
So just a further questions for Aaron. You made some reference to other councils having costs around 90 million, so I presume that's Gore. And
No, actually, the one that I was referring to was the Banks Peninsula one, which is a slightly smaller council. The Gore
Sure.
one's a little bit different because although their costs are up around, I think, that 80 to 90 million, that's across 2 treatment plants.
Yep. So these ones that you referred to being 90 million and beyond, are they discharged to land, or are they upgrading actual plants?
Jim may have some more information than me on the Banks Peninsula one, but it's quite a different process to the norm, as I understand it. It would be a land-based discharge. Jim, do you know much about that one?
Yes, and Stantec is involved in both Akaroa and Palmerston North. The Akaroa has been a long journey, and it is looking at irrigation, slow rate irrigation on establishing native trees. The other one Aaron talked about, the 400 to 500 million, the Palmerston North project, that is a monster, as the numbers indicate, and it is based on a land application slow rate irrigation scheme when the Manawatu River drops below down to the 25%, the low flow, clicks in a 700 or 1,000 hectare plus irrigation system. So it's a combination of river and land as proposed at the moment.
So we're not really, this is for you, Aaron, so we're not, in that statement, we're not comparing apples with apples, are we?
Not in terms of the process that we'd put forward under 1F. We were obviously still talking about a discharge to water.
Sure.
The only reason I used that was for the context of when the government says they are going to significantly cut the costs of discharge. I expect that they will probably have those sorts of project numbers in their head when they're making those statements. I just don't have that certainty as to whether or not they would see the $6 million process reduced to $1 or $2 million. They may, but I'm simply not sure.
Well, the advice I'm getting, and you'll have heard the public statements as well by the government, is that they're focusing on 2 things. One is the actual consenting process itself, the cost, which I think you advised me today that if we do a short-term status quo consent cost, it's 385,000. So the government sees that as excessive, so they'll be looking to streamline that so it's a simpler pathway. But I guess they're also looking at the range of options that we have available to us, which is right from status quo through to land discharge.
Yeah.
And I think they'll make some statements about the land discharge stuff, because the national cost runs into billions of dollars. So interested in that. Just interested in the comments that we've heard today about biodiversity. That's the first time I've heard that in this discussion. All the way through, we've been talking about the 4 criteria for a consent being health, affordability, cultural values, and environmental enhancement. Biodiversity is not the latter, is it?
And I'm sorry, which was the...
Well,
biodiversity is not the which? Sorry?
it's not environmental enhancement.
So Sue's probably the best one to be able to speak to that piece.
Yep. So in terms of the criteria that were used through the whole assessment of alternatives process, essentially when we were talking about the environmental or biophysical or that kind of element, we always considered a number of different compartments of the environment. So we considered the coastal environment, the surface water environment, groundwater, and also land. And biodiversity is an inherent component of that land piece. And also the impact on climate change. So the contribution of the option in terms of changes in the amount of greenhouse gas that's emitted. So that has been part of the assessment right the way through the process.
Paper, when it spoke about the pros and cons of the different options, noted the biodiversity as being one of the benefits that the working group had assessed.
Yeah, I know the paper said that's one of the benefits, it's a spin-off of it, but you heard Barry's comment before, which the chair put aside, and we'll certainly have that at the next meeting, the extraordinary meeting, is that if we have a wetlands that doesn't enhance the environmental impacts of a consent, it does have a spin-off that so it's a nice to have thing.
Yeah.
Then why would we go to a $6 million cost to put a wetlands in if it doesn't add any value to what we discharge out into the ocean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's ratepayers' money.
Yeah, that's just a rhetorical question. Okay.
Yep, okay.
Ria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Erin, as I'm looking through the paper and listening to the commentary at the table this morning,
Can you talk into the...
sorry.
Yeah.
Erin, as I listened to the commentary in our paper this morning, you've given us a figure of option 1 would cost in the vicinity of $6 million plus the operational process. So in that respect, given that Councillor Campbell asked about the UV treatment, is that included in that option 1 for the upgrade within 2 years?
Yes, as I recall it was, yeah.
Okay, that's cool. And then option 2, you've given us a price for $12 million double the cost of option 1, but that also is an open-ended area in terms of the operational process?
So no, what I'm simply saying is that there could be higher costs, we simply don't know. The expectation is that the costs are likely to be lower under the new standards, but we simply don't know that at this point in time. What I would say is under option 2, you would still need to obviously go ahead with the UV and the pipe. As I recall, the costs of that were about just over 1.5 million to go ahead with that, and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask Sue a question now, please?
Yep.
Sue, I just would like you to make further commentary on the biodiversity enhancement to this consent versus you mentioned that you didn't think that the wetland would suffice in terms of all that we're required to do. I'm just a little bit confused about that. So can you kind of, I guess, give us a idea the wetlands versus the need to do a biodiversity enhancement? What other option would there be?
So can I just paraphrase the question just to make sure I understand it? Are you saying that if we didn't do the wetland, is there another option that we could do that would improve biodiversity? Is that the question?
I guess it is, given that earlier in a statement that you'd made, you'd said about the wetlands, I took from what you'd said that the wetlands wasn't a great option, however it ticked the box for biodiversity aspects.
In terms of the environmental outcome, I think she's
Yes.
referencing, Sue.
So I'm just trying to,
So I may be able to help with that, and then Sue may be able to follow on. Again, if we recall back to the previous process and the discussions of the pros and cons of 1F versus 1G, 1A, etc., one of the things that we looked at was an option where we said we would upgrade the treatment, and that would be the environmental benefit. And what we found was that because the discharge quality at Bluff was already quite high, that there'd be significant costs of creating a higher level of treatment that really wouldn't, the benefits of doing that really outweighed the cost associated with doing that. Is that fair, Andrew and Jim? Fair assessment? Yeah. And so as a result, we didn't proceed with an option to improve the treatment discharge and therefore the environmental outcomes through the treatment. However, the working group was obviously looking to try to balance these different competing priorities of affordability, environment, cultural, etc. And obviously the previous RMA process is a process around trying to weigh up those various different competing priorities and get to something that all of the key stakeholders and parties can agree to. And 1F was the option whereby, although it didn't have that immediate discharge environmental benefit, it was agreed that it had a biodiversity benefit, and therefore that was part of it being key in gaining the support of Te Ao Marama and Awarua Rananga.
Okay, and final supplementary to that. With your knowledge, are you aware of any other council in this country going...
Who's the question to, sorry?
Aaron.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Are you aware of any other council in New Zealand that is or has gone through a consent similar to this, where this cost estimate is way higher than anywhere else in New Zealand for the size that we're dealing with?
Sorry, are you asking if the costs increased
or
through the project?
This cost that has projected, although we know that it could be higher, is this $6 million cost or the option 2 cost, does that exceed any other council consenting in New Zealand previously or in the future, which is difficult to say, but is this cost, I guess, is it realistic? Is it blown out? Is it over-costed? Is it under-costed?
So I think compared to other councils, and that's why I sort of wanted to note some of the, particularly that Banks Peninsula process. Yeah. There are some processes around the country where the costs are absolutely, exorbitant in my view. We know, I think, that the Southland District Council have now got an interim consent where they relook at what they do with their Winton plant, but the costs, I think, we're getting up in well into the tens of millions of dollars for that plant. Obviously, the Mayor noted the costs that have been put in the long-term plan for the Mataura and Gore plants, both running into the tens of millions of dollars, and they were both ones, again, we're looking to move away from discharge to water and move more towards discharge to land. Obviously, through this process, we looked at some of those discharge to land options and some really significant costs associated with that, but it was found that that wasn't a very practical solution for Gore, and obviously it also weighed up that reasonableness around affordability and cost for the community, and came to this middle ground sort of compromise option. Now, there's feasibility that is going on at the moment for that process. At the moment, it's not indicating that those costs for the wetland would increase. In fact, Alistair will probably kick me under the table. There's some indication that those costs may be a bit lower, but we weren't ready to commit to that just yet. But yeah, at the moment, those costs seem realistic for the work that we're proposing to do, if 1F was the option.
Okay, thank you.
For both, they'd be the best estimates at the current point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Got Alex, then Ray, then Evelyn, Tom, then Nobby. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Rightio. I do have 2 questions. I've got a question and then a supplementary question, but I just want to make sure that I've got my context correct before I get there, so give me a minute. So our final decision, it hinges on the release of the standardisation. We're currently deciding whether or not we invest more upfront, which is the known cost by lodging the 1F application, to Councillor Boyle's point, which is initially going to safeguard the process in case the standardisation fails to meet our expectations or introduces unforeseen activity standards or statuses that could drive up those costs.
That's correct.
Right. Alternatively, we could lodge the short-term placeholder consent. If the standardisation delivers the anticipated cost savings, that would prove to be the right choice. However, if it falls short of our expectations, reverting back to 1F option is no longer feasible, potentially leading to costs escalating to unaffordable levels.
That's correct.
As we've seen around the country. Yep. So today's decision really comes down to spend money on known cost now with option 1F, or in that same effort to reduce costs, opt to lodge a short-term consent. Honestly, that makes me really uncomfortable that we're effectively playing Russian roulette because we could potentially shoot ourselves in the foot. So I just wanted to confirm with you, Erin, in your expert opinion on the balance of probabilities, it is far more likely that the short-term placeholder will reduce or will result in cost savings based on what we know currently when the standardisation is released.
I think it's very clear to say that the government has made a big commitment that it will significantly reduce the cost for consenting treatment plants. What I'm saying is that every treatment plant is different, and therefore what may come out of that process you know, I would expect it's possibly going to be a process where we're already close to meeting the discharge standards and our upgrades would be minimal. But I can't say that with any great confidence.
And that's the piece I think that I'm most uncomfortable with, is that we can't, we're effectively gambling. You know, we're gambling, or we're taking a punt that hopefully we're already close to meeting those standards.
Yeah. Look, I think from a very simple council staff perspective, I'd like to, you know, have a bob each way, continue with the current process and then see what happens. But I'm also very aware that politically that may be a difficult position for council to start down one path, make some commitments to doing something and then decide to change to a different path, maybe politically a difficult pathway as well. So I absolutely understand both perspectives.
My supplementary question to that, though, is that if we did go with status quo or the short-term consent and the standardisation is released, do we still have that option to upscale?
Sorry, if you went with 1F, would you still have the option to?
No, if we went with the short-term option, or option 2, and the standardisation is released, and you know, elections pass next year, there's a new council, is there an opportunity to choose to upscale or change our consent at that point in time?
So what would happen is you would simply lodge a short-term consent, the new standards would come out, and then you would very quickly be into the process of a new consent application for a 35-year consent to meet the new standards.
Yep. And that'd be the off-the-shelf standardisation that
yes.
Okay,
that's right.
Thank you.
And it could be that the existing plant pretty much meets those new standards.
Yeah. Chair, I'm just conscious that we've just also got a slide to talk through on significance as well. So
significance in terms of
significance, or the significance and engagement process and the community consultation process
so
on this
we've
one.
still got a little bit of time left, so I'll get through these people. So I've got Ray, Evelyn, Tom, Mia Clark, then Rangi, then Leslie. So if you're not on that list, you're not speaking. Ray.
Thank you for allowing me to speak, Grant. The Bluff Community Board stance is still we support 1F. I haven't had a meeting recently to go over it because some of the requirements under the new the bill going through, we're not aware of it. But I don't think it would change our stance whatsoever. It's preemptive. You're looking at something that may or may not happen. At the moment, there's a option going through that we're going into it with our eyes open. We know what the cost is. We know what it's all about. All this other stuff, we'll be going into it with our eyes closed. And when we do open them up, we go, hell, what do we do? We're going to be in a lot of trouble here. To say that it may reduce costs, we do not know. The longer you drag things out these days, the more expensive it gets day by day. So, you know, it could be more expensive. And I think listening to some of the speakers as well could leave the council wide open for further repercussions as well. So as a councillor, I'm not a councillor, but you'd have to be aware of that. So we do support 1F, fully support it. As Erin said, one of the options that was preferred was to be land-based, but because of the where we are in Bluff, it was not possible, and hence a lot of councils are going down that track. And we have looked at it and decided that for where we are in Bluff, to support the community, that 1F was the best option, and I don't think we're going to back away from it, put it at that. We're just going to see how this plays out, but our personal view is, my personal view is that it's the option's affordable, it's practicable, it meets the requirements. All the working groups that were part of this process supported 1F, and I'll be probably a bit disappointed if it moves away from that process. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Evelyn.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. So, just to go back from the questions about who is supporting or not supporting, Te Marama is a resource management entity works for their client, which is the Awaroa Rūnaka, which is a constituent owner of our entity. Reria Hakiwai is the staff member who has been the member of the working party. The people who are empowered to speak for the organisation are Reria, on this matter, are Reria and Dean Whanga, who is our manager. The opinions and voices of anybody else are just the opinions and voices of anybody else. We're not operating on a political basis, we're operating on an environmental basis and advocating on behalf of the client. So on that basis, as a person who has worked in environmental space for approximately 30 years, I understand that none of this is perfect. What I believe option 1F offers the council is ability to do something a little bit better than we've done in the past, to create a little bit of a win in terms of the biodiversity, which has been quite degraded in the area that we're talking about. This is not just plant life, it is bird life, it is the whole thing. One of the things that seemed to me that there's a misunderstanding about wetland. It is not a lake or a pond. This is swampy ground with the appropriate reeds and sedges and plants that will help what we like to think is take some of the less palatable aspects of human waste out of the discharge system. Is it what we would desire? No, it's not. As an iwi person, as a person who whakapapas te Awaroa, it's not my preferred option. But the Rūnaka's made a compromise. Te ao Marama has helped negotiate the way. I think that what we're looking at and what we're talking about today is making the best of what we as humans don't always do very well, which is take care of the problems that we create. But I really want to emphasise that we're supportive of Bluff community, we're supportive of Awaroa. We did not discuss this yesterday because it's no longer a governance matter, it hasn't been for quite some time. It is an operational matter, and the operational team now run this process. So I as a governor do not participate in this process. But I would really like to add my voice to the fact that as prudent as we need to be on behalf of the citizens of Invercargill, is we need to operate within the law as we know it exists today and not speculate about what it might be in 2 years' time. We know what we're dealing with now. If I could design a perfect system, it would not necessarily look like this. But we're making compromises, we're all making compromises to get something that might actually help us move forward in another 25 years when technology will have improved, when the opportunities are different. So that's where I am with that.
So, excuse me, Chair.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt, but we've only got half an hour, and
sorry.
Erin's going to talk about significance. I see what everyone's talking about is for our next section of the meeting.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm just wondering if the Chair would concentrate on questions.
Yeah, I know. So I just want to clarify a couple of points I think Ray touched on and then Evelyn, that both option 1 and 2 are within the law, as we've heard from our experts. Okay, and Jeanette's not here, but Erin, you'll confirm that?
Yeah, that's right. So both options 1 and 2 are compliant with the current RMA framework.
Yeah, so the references to, running roughshod over law, I don't think that was the exact words, but that's what I interpreted to be. They're not accurate. But both processes, 1 and 2, that are 3 that would potentially put us in legally. Righto, so Tom, and then Nobby, and then Rangi, and then Leslie.
Okay. I'm really interested in the conversation, and one of the things that popped into my mind when Ria was speaking, I think she sort of edged towards this question, and it never quite got there. Sorry, is this mic not working? Can you not hear me?
Sorry, okay now, sorry.
Okay. It seems to me that 1F is in fact two projects. You have on the one hand the project on wastewater, where in terms of water quality, discharge quality, and there is a question at the end of this, I promise. In terms of discharge quality, essentially it's going to be the same as 1A, it might even be slightly degraded, but fundamentally the discharge quality is going to be the same. But the point of 1F, the second part of 1F, which is really about, wetland biodiversity and, an enhanced amenity for Bluff to some extent, seems to me to potentially be a quite separate project. So, Erin, could I ask, at the moment we're kind of shoehorning in the wetland into the discharge, which involves, I think we talked about new pumps and so forth. If the wetland was a separate project purely to enhance the environment and to increase biodiversity, maybe in a different location, maybe in the same location, but not related to the wastewater plant, would it be cheaper to provide?
I couldn't answer that in terms of we haven't assessed other potential locations for a wetland and looked at whether or not there may be a cheaper place to provide that. What I would say is that adding a wetland, a land contact via wetland process is something that is quite often used as an upgrade to treatment plants around the country. It's one of those ones where, in a similar place to what we've gotten to, there was, stakeholders, iwi in particular, are looking for that land discharge option in instances where that's not able to be achieved either through environmental constraints of the land that you have available or affordability constraints. It's often been seen as that compromised option between of gaining some degree of environmental benefit. Jim, I guess, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Just to confirm that we have a number of wetlands of various types, particularly the naturalistic ones, the wildlife ones, ones from a Maori cultural point of view that have been added to in-tank treatment plants around New Zealand over the years and have been through similar processes in terms of the robustness of an alternatives assessment to meet the requirements of the RMA. It's appreciated that wetlands there's wetlands and wetlands, and the natural processes that take place come into it very much. But there is quite a list around the country of these, including 2 or 3 being looked at the moment in the Manatū, Lake Ferry, and others.
Could you hear that?
I struggled a little bit with it, but I guess the basis of my question is whether the wetland could be provided as just a quite separate project. It may be less cost because it doesn't have to be plumbed into the wastewater system. It doesn't need pumps to pump it out.
I think the difficulty with that one, Councillor Campbell, is, and Pania may be able to provide some guidance here, is that I'm not sure that separating the two is an option that would be supported by all members of that working group.
So Jim, just to clarify the question from Councillor Campbell, so are you aware of any of those projects, and you said there's a number that are around New Zealand that have been done separately from the wastewater process?
Yes, I might have not picked the question up correctly. So this is looking at wetland as an enhancement, a mitigation in the bigger picture of a wastewater system, but not physically connected to the treated wastewater from the wastewater plant. And in that respect, the only one that really comes to mind is a part of the proposal of the Palmerston North scheme, where the enhancement of natural but deteriorated wetlands would be part of what we call the offset mitigation. as part of the total package. A number of schemes around New Zealand have offset mitigation that's not physically part of the scheme. Palmerston North proposal comes to mind at the moment. I'm not close enough to know of others. I hope that helps, Councillor.
So can I just clarify what you've said there, Jim? So the proposal that we have with 1F, the wastewater is not connected to the proposed wetland. Is that what you've just said?
To the wetland.
Right, yeah, okay.
Yes,
Yeah. I think what Councillor Campbell's saying is could you have a wetland that you simply established in the area that didn't have the wastewater discharge moving through it? It may be possible there is already an area of what was historically a wetland. Whether or not you would get enough water through it to create a wetland area, I'm not sure. That's not something that we've investigated separately. And the main reason for that being that one of the key criteria that we were looking for was an unchallenged consent process, and that was what we got through discharging the wastewater through the wetland. I wouldn't expect that we would get that by simply having the wetlands stand alone from the treatment plant.
Well, if it was biodiversity improvement and enhancement of amenity in the area, it might be that would be achieved not through a wetland but by some other means which did increase biodiversity.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Mayor Clark.
Yeah, just two quick questions. One of them's a clarification, Aaron. So, just touching on what Ria said, she asked you a question about whether examples of a biodiversity wetlands in New Zealand that was cheaper or more expensive than the $6 million we got earmarked. My question's down the same line. Do you have any examples of wetlands being used in New Zealand purely for diversity reasons?
Yes, we do, because that's where I became aware of the potential for the slight degradation in the treatment discharge. Yep. Jim, I'm just trying to remember which one that was, where they've run into some problems with the discharge.
There have been a number where particularly open water has resulted in high bird numbers, and the bird droppings, for example, come into it. And that's seen in two different ways. It's a natural thing often looked at, or is it, and what is the public health associated with that? So that needs to be taken into account in the type of wetland we're looking at. I could run through a few naturalistic type approaches in wetlands if that helped councillors, but the design and operation of it in terms of the diffuseness and following the contours, etc., are very much part of the naturalistic. If I can add that, Sue, is there anything you want to add on that, because you've been working this one through in detail?
Yep. So I guess there's two aspects or two responses. One of them is the risk of the degradation of the treated wastewater quality it was a risk that we identified. It wasn't a definite effect, and that was on the basis of what has happened at other installations of wetlands on the back of treated wastewater. And as Jim said, that's from standing water surface, and the way that we are currently designing the riverine wetland is that we are making sure that there is no standing water, and it is, as somebody mentioned, that it will essentially be sort of grassy and swampy rather than having open water. Sorry, you were...
Say that where a wetland is a land contact wetland versus a land treatment wetland, that generally the benefit would be a biodiversity one versus a treatment improvement one?
Yes, and generally that is a result of you don't actually try and retain the water and treat it within the wetland. You are just passing it through the wetland. So, and hence the two risks is one is the birds coming in and affecting the quality. That is mitigated by not having standing water surfaces. And then the other one is that it can pick up things on its way through the wetland. And that is something that happened in the Mataura wetland a number of years ago now, but they put a wetland on the back of the Mataura wastewater treatment plant, and they did find that the suspended solids in the effluent went up. However, what they did find is that I was involved with that process. The nature of the discharge actually improved from an ecological perspective, because it went from oxidation pond solids to more mineral solids. So there is potential for changes in the treated wastewater quality, but they're not necessarily ecologically problematic changes.
So just one other question, and that's to Jim, if you can hear me, Jim. You made the statement before about, and I'll just quote back to you, you said, descoping what you've originally inserted can be more difficult than adding stuff later on. So in lay terms, what you're saying to us is in fact part of the advice I'm getting from government at the moment is don't go for an option with a huge cost attached to it, because if you do and the new standards don't require that, it's very hard to back away from that. It's better to go in with a status quo or very low option, because you can always add to it at a later stage. Taking away is more difficult than adding.
Sorry, I had a phone going. I think that the slides clearly cover that point in terms of
or consenting advice piece versus a gym piece.
Well, I think, it's a little bit, well, put it in lay terms. I offered to take one of my grandkids to Disneyland, and then I find out that I don't actually need to take them that far. I'll go somewhere else. It's really hard when you back away from an ultimate option. It's much better to say, look, I'll take you on a trip, but I won't actually say where it is till I actually know what my resources are looking like. I mean, we heard earlier this week, 8.5% rate increase for this year. I mean, inflation's at 2.2. How do we rationalise spending extra money, or offering extra money, before we know what the standards are? Because the standards may well say Bluff is actually okay the way it is.
It may.
Yeah. Okay. Ringy.
Thank you, Chair.
Right. Okay, so you go down the option 2 path, and council decides that in the next, half an hour or so, whatever. Obviously, it's going to have to be notified that if they go option 2, is that right, Erin? Because it's obviously there are people who disagree.
Yes, so my question would be, and I'd need to get clarity from Jeanette, but I would expect that it would be either a limited or a publicly notified process.
Right, okay. So it then goes through that consultation process and rocks up at Environment Southland. And Environment Southland sits there, looks at it and goes, nah, we're not going to grant you consent. What happens then when the consent is not, if perchance it's not granted? What happens?
So the feedback would come back to us, and we would need to make changes to that to put forward something that was acceptable, or we would need to go through that Environment Court challenge process. What I would say, though, is that I do think it's unlikely that they wouldn't accept it. We're aware of the fact that there are already councils like Southland District who were able to get a short-term consent while they did some more work on their plant. The advice always from Jeanette all the way through, even prior to the latest legislative change, was if you lodge a application on a 1A, she would expect us to get a consent. It would just be a short-term consent.
It wouldn't go to the Environment Court?
It would only go to the Environment Court if you got nothing, but that's very unlikely.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Erin, do you want to finish off?
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
So I'll flip to that final one. And it may have gone to sleep now. Can we go one more there, Michelle? Oh, no, don't worry. It's now working. Sorry. Okay, so consultation. So this is the final piece of the puzzle for councillors, whether or not each of these options triggers our significant an engagement process. And Rhiannon has come to the table, so she's able to talk through that. What I would note is I had, in the absence of having Rhiannon to consult with late last week, I had just put an error into the council paper, which I'll also amend in the meeting. I had noted that it would be recommended around public consultation consultation for option 3. I've since been advised via legal advice from Michael Morris that it would not be recommended that council consult on a process whereby council would be looking not to follow existing legislation. So we'd make that amendment. Rhiannon?
Thanks, Erin. So just some points for you to consider in relation to consultations. All of this advice is in line with the significance and engagement policy, as close as I can be, which obviously states that the ultimate decision to consult and to assess significance is council's. So in line with that policy, the advice that you've already had in an earlier paper is remembering that the additional amount of funding and the expectation to the community that there would be further investment in Bluff for the wastewater treatment plant was included in the long-term plan, and some engagement has taken place through the process that the team has been running around options 1F and 1G. So 1G is probably no longer relevant to this conversation, but on that balance of that there's no need to consult to proceed to the RMA process. If you choose the short-term application, given that it is short-term, it is not a permanent solution, then I think it's really important to consider whether the costs, and in this case particularly non-financial costs of consultation, really would outweigh any benefits of moving to consultation on this one. And that's something for you guys to consider. You are aware of those stakeholders who are not in agreement of the short-term application. You are already aware of those views. It is a short-term temporary solution. It's just previously been discussed that as you move to the RMA consent process, there's going to be potentially a different process there. If you do choose to consult, then there is the option to do that alongside the annual plan. We already have quite a number of topics. There is, including the importance of consulting on the water service delivery plan. We have been consulting with the community on many, many different topics. We have some consultation fatigue out there. So those are really the points that I wanted to raise, and happy to take any questions.
Everyone clear?
I think the final piece I'd just add is that if we do move to public consultation, originally the time frame for this process had expected a public consultation process, and we'd made sure that we had time to do that. If we are to lodge an application by the 13th of May, whether it be a 1F or a status quo application, we are really starting to struggle for time. And so I'm just making council aware of the fact that we need to move to a decision reasonably quickly to be able to hit those timeframes. The process to prepare the environmental impact statement sections of an application and the cultural impact assessment stages of the implications of the application are ones that we've been advised will take several months.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we're done. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and thank you also for the way you've engaged in the workshop. Thank you to our specialists, Jeanette, who's left, obviously Andrew, Alistair, you got off pretty scot-free, I think, so Jim and Sue, really appreciate sort of the way you've engaged with us in this process, and it is a challenge, no question about that. It's a challenging time, and then we've been overlaid with sort of regulatory change in terms of indications of how that might fall. So we're done. Thank you for attending, Ray, and we'll be back here in about 8 minutes to work through the decision process. Thank you for all those who attend on live stream.